What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of A Point in Focus, the official podcast of pointsinfocus.com and the Points in Focus YouTube channel. I'm Jason, and this is my little corner of the internet or whatever, where I talk about things that interest me in photography or that I couldn't really cover in a video that I put up looking at something very technical or more detailed, and kind of expand upon and discuss some of the things that I ran into with that video or situations that I ran into with that video. So last week, or this week, depending on which day of the week your weeks start on, I posted, or last Tuesday, I guess is the best way to put it, I put up a video looking at an in-depth sort of look at what exactly is going on with Canon's auto black balance on the EOS R5C, although it also applies to other cinema cameras. And that video ended up being a lot longer than I intended it to be. It actually ended up being a lot more comprehensive, or I ended up finding out things, I guess is the way to put it, that I didn't expect to see. I honestly went into it kind of expecting auto black balance to be sort of a vestigial thing from the early cinema camera days that didn't really necessarily apply anymore, and I wasn't 100% convinced that it was going to actually be doing anything, or anything appreciable or measurable or significant enough to care about on the R5C, and by extension, potentially on Canon's other cameras. And to a certain extent, that's still true. It doesn't really make that big of a difference if you aren't running it compared to if you are running it. I know there's an awful lot of R5C shooters who don't run auto black balance every day that before they start shooting, or in any of the cases that Canon says to do it. There were certainly instances where I saw changes that I didn't expect to see, and there were places where I expected to see changes and didn't see changes. And I think what's going on under the hood there is more complicated than it seems at first glance. But before I get into kind of talking about all of that sort of stuff, I want to talk really briefly about sort of the bigger picture about testing and looking at stuff like that. So first of all, I've said this a couple of other videos, and I'm going to keep saying this probably for a long time to come. I don't work for Canon. Neither Canon USA, Canon Japan. I have no affiliation with Canon whatsoever. I'm not an Explorer of Light. I'm not a Canon ambassador. I don't get free gear from them. They don't even know I exist, other than the fact that I've bought stuff and had to send it into them for repair. I am a CPS member. There's some technical stuff that you can get through CPS, but I've never actually made use of much of that. Certainly not for any of this stuff. This is all 100% independent testing. I am taking my gear, developing tests, and testing it. So the short of what I'm getting at here is, because I don't have access to internal documentation or the source code for the firmwares or anything like that, understanding or extrapolating exactly what's happening is a guess. I can look at what I see with the inputs, I can look at the outputs or that I get from those inputs, and I can extrapolate what the camera appears to be doing with that data, or to get to that data, but I can't say for certain. On top of that, this probably should go without saying, I miss things occasionally. I'm like everybody, I have an inherent, you could call it bias or blindness, however you want to put it, to, I have to think of how to test things. I have to think about what's important and what's relevant and what I am going to focus on. And I, for one reason or another, can very simply just not think of something that was relevant, or not think of an approach to test something. And if I didn't think of it, I didn't test it. So there is always the possibility, both from the fact that I don't know exactly what the camera's doing, and from the fact that I can miss a very valid way or point in testing something, or a valid test, that stuff is not necessarily complete. To sort of build on that point, I do what I think of or consider to be exploratory science. Uh, if you're at least from the United States and went to public school, you probably were taught something about the scientific method and some line about how you create a hypothesis, you develop a test, and then you execute your test and you collate and process the data, and then you determine whether or not you support the hypothesis you developed or not. I don't work like that for this kind of stuff. I basically throw darts. I go in, I have an idea of like a first place to test to see if something is going to work. Does auto black balance even do anything or not? And I make a very basic test, and then, oh, it's doing something. So let's test certain conditions that should cause problems. What do we get from that? Largely because for this kind of stuff, like I don't want to. Well, I don't see any need to figure out or to go in expecting an answer. I see a very useful point of just going in and seeing what it does, because when push comes to shove, it's camera gear, and if we can get from point A to point B and figure out what things or how things work, and or how to get something out of it, and not necessarily that we rigidly confirmed some kind of standard approach that's taught in school, I'm fine with that. On top of that, a lot of the testing I do, or I should say not necessarily on top of that, at the same time, the reason I say this is scientific or engineering or however you want to put it based testing is because I am doing things in a way where I'm trying to control variables. I don't want 50,000 things to change. Example, you get a new lens, you take it to the zoo to photograph the wildlife because that's your jam, and you find some of your pictures are soft. Is it because the lens isn't focusing? Is it because you weren't holding the camera steady? Is it because the tiger was moving around when you were shooting and the shutter speed wasn't high enough? That's a great thing to do to get comfortable with the lens, but like the first step in testing it to me is you put it on a resolution chart and you make sure that everything's sharp and looks good. That controls all of the variables. You're on a tripod, it's a fixed chart, there's nothing's moving, etc. That at least tells you that the lens focuses right and is sharp. And then when you go out and you start looking at like real world pictures, you have more variables, but you can at least be confident that some of the stuff, like the lens being sharp or focusing the way it's supposed to, you've already verified that that's the case. So that's kind of the way I approach all of these kind of testing / reverse engineering / however you want to put it type of projects. At the same time, designing the tests for this stuff, I'm struck always with a dilemma. Do I try to test for the underlying whatever it is process at the like basic most level, and then build out from there? Obviously that controls the most variables. Or do I start my testing at sort of a higher level? If for example I shoot most of my content in 1080p, but 1080p 4K, it doesn't matter. If it's not visible in 4K or doesn't make a difference in 4K or 1080 or wherever you shoot, does it matter if it makes a difference in 8K? Or does it matter if you figured out that the underlying process is doing X, but that never actually makes it meaningfully to your compressed files at the end? I tend to, in some ways, go for what I get at the end, because in some respects, as much as I love the engineering and love getting into the engineering and picking apart what's going on at a super deep technical level, at the end of the day, what I care about is, do I get a picture on my camera that looks good? Or do I have a problem, or does this function make a meaningful difference in the video or photography or whatever that I'm shooting? So perhaps it's not the best way to go about doing things, but then, as often is the case, I have a limited amount of time to work on this stuff. There's a limited amount of resources. There's only so far I can go. And in a lot of cases, unlike on the still photography side of things, as I'm starting to test video stuff, it's very difficult to get direct numerical data out of the raw video formats. They are not, there's an open source library, libraw, that basically allows you to decode any of the still image raw formats, even the compressed ones like Canon C-RAW or the Nikon Star, Raw Star, or whatever they call their highly compressed version. It can basically read all of those from any camera and give you, because it's an open source library, you can get direct numerical data out of it. What the actual pixel values are, what the raw file says the black level adjustment should be, what the raw file says the white balance gains, etc. should be. And that information, that capability doesn't currently, at least to my knowledge, exist for the cinema raw formats, whether it's Canons, Nikons, Sonys, whatever. You can, of course, run them, for example, Canon Cinema Raw Lite. You can run it through the Canon Cinema Raw development software. You can run it through something like Blackmagic Design's DaVinci Resolve, or Adobe's Premiere Pro, or Apple's Final Cut Pro, and export it as something else. But largely in all of those cases, it's very difficult to get that into a linear amount of data in a compressed format or an uncompressed format where you can then extrapolate actual information from it, or you can extract actual information from it, numerical information. Almost everything that's out there is going to recompress the file lossily, even if it doesn't seem like it, because it's going to put a gamma curve on it. It's going to put it's not clear at all what's being done. So while I would absolutely love to have run some, if not all, of these tests in RAW, without being able to get actual straight numbers that I can process and deal with effectively, it's very difficult for me to kind of consider that a viable approach. So that's why I didn't do it in RAW, and why I continue to kind of have to work around that as a situation. There's obviously places where RAW might give better information, but if I can't extract or the information from it to do it, and I know with confidence that I'm getting that kind of low-level information, I don't know, I can't, it's not really useful. So one of the things that I talked about in the video with respect to black levels, and I showed a series of slides showing how this affects the black levels being wrong, show this how this affects color balances, specifically the effect on color balance in your very darks, your shadows, etc. And I talked about this in the video, but then all the testing I did was based just purely on luminance information. And that seems, and in retrospect, I stepped back and looked at it long after I had sort of finished everything, and sort of thinking about what I did and what I should have done and maybe what I could have added or taken out or whatever, and said to myself, I probably should have talked more about in the testing, or done more testing on color balance. And then I kind of realized I don't know how. There's ways that I could do it that would be very convoluted and involved, because so the first problem is black balance and all the tests that I did looking at black, the auto black balance and all the tests looking at it are done at in black, with the sensor is completely in the dark. There is no light whatsoever. And in that case, all of the usual metrics that you would use for talking about color don't work. Hue doesn't really mean anything. Hue angle doesn't mean anything, because red, blue, green, yellow, orange, magenta, all of those are just black, because there's no light. There's nothing to capture. So your hue angle, like if you look at the hue angle, and I actually did go back because I had all the data. I still have all the data, but I went back and I reprocessed some of the stuff to look at like what was going on with the color, with the hue. And in the the cases where I had horrible like calibration of the black levels, the hue was all over the place. The hue angle was, just pointing, every frame it pointed in every different direction. And in the ones where I had good black balance based on what I saw in the tests, it was more consistent, like it had one angle. But again, you have to think about this as like trying to tell which angle you're at the point of a top or something like that. It's a precarious little point that, depending on the slightest error in or change in noise or anything else, the angle is going to change. So that kind of gives you information, and the short of it is the hue basically did the same thing that the black levels did. So when the black levels were tight and consistent, had very small frame-to-frame standard deviation, the hue was very consistent and had a very small frame-to-frame standard deviation. When the black levels were not tight, they were uncalibrated and all over the place, the hue frame-to-frame, or average hue frame-to-frame, basically did the same thing. It was all over the place. And so there's not, like, in retrospect, it would have been good to talk about it, but functionally speaking, I didn't have anything that I could, really say about that. The other way that most people would talk about, or to want to talk about color, would be like color temperature. Again, it's not defined for black. At the signal levels that we're talking about, it doesn't even make sense to talk about color temperature, because there's nothing for it to work with. You're at a luminance level that is so low that, because it is zero, that you don't have any of the like color temperature handles that you would normally talk about. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. It doesn't give you any useful information. So on the color front, it certainly could be valuable to maybe devise a new test and go back and look at that at some point to see just what the effect is. There clearly was an effect in the massively uncalibrated files. The red levels tended to be much higher than the blue or green levels based on the color temperature set on the camera, which was like 5,000 or 5,500 Kelvin, and that would tend to increase the red gain on the sensor, because the light is bluer, and therefore to neutralize it, the gains, and there's a lot of complexity that goes into all of that. Because, for example, the color filters, the red, green, and blue color filters on your sensor, they don't pass equal intensities. The blue filter tends to be the darkest of all of the colors, and therefore the sensor if you have a neutral gray signal, and ignoring white balance adjustments on per pixel or per color channel gain, if you have a neutral gray signal and that signal goes through the color filter array, and you amplify all three channels with the same amount of gain, so whatever gain that is, but it's the same across all three channels, you won't actually have a neutral color out of that. green passes the most light, red generally second, blue's usually the third. So just in a neutral, like a purely ignoring color temperature of light and all of that, the blue channel tends to get amplified the most, which is why blue tends to be the noisiest when you look at per color channel noise and stuff. The green channel is the least, and the red channel is usually in the middle. So there's a lot of complexity because of, that's still happening. You're still doing that correction. This is one place where RAW could potentially or would potentially help. In RAW, even the Cinema Raw codecs, even though the Canon Cinema Raw codecs are not linear, there is a log gamma curve associated with them, or a log optoelectric transfer function, to put it properly, associated with them. The color information is going to be, or the pixel information is still being encoded without a color correction. So that's something that's being stored separate as metadata, at least as far as I understand it, which is why you can change the color temperature in DaVinci Raw, or whatever raw video editing point or software you're using, because it's basically the file has the gains that were set in the camera applied, but your computer, you can change the gains because the data in the file is still the unmodified pixel data, aside from that transfer function that was applied to it, that is being stored. Which brings me to the sort of second problem that I kind of ran into after the fact in thinking about this, but not sure how relevant it is. It goes back to that whole question I made at the start about whether do you look at what you get, or do you look at what the underlying process is doing and then work your way to what you get? And what's really the important part about that? Is it the underlying process, or is it what you are actually getting that matters the most in how you're designing and what you're testing for? So I did all these tests in Canon Log 3. The R5C doesn't support log 2. I could have done them in log 1. That would have changed, potentially given a little bit more accuracy to the information, but it's also not what I shoot. And since I want something that's relevant, at least in part, to what I shoot, granted, I'm trying to make the information available for everybody else, and the difference isn't going to be significantly meaningful, I don't think. But I also, if I'm going to go through all the testing, I do kind of want something I can use instead of something that's completely useless to me, even if it might be useful to somebody else. The problem with log gammas, and the thing that nobody seems to talk about. Everybody, if you watch every cinematographer, photographer that's out there that's talking about log gammas, they will always tell you log gammas are to extend the dynamic range. That's the story that everybody repeats over and over. Log gammas are there to extend dynamic range, which is a true statement when your reference point is Rec. 709. And that's generally the approach that video-centric people are going to talk about. Log gammas extend dynamic range. If you are used to working or started working in Rec. 709, shooting in a log gamma format will give you more dynamic range than what you had in Rec. 709. If you're used to shooting in stills in RAW, as I am, then the correct statement for what log gammas do is it's lossy compression. The way log gammas extend dynamic range relative to a Rec. 709 file is they look at how many steps of brightness information is stored in a given stop of your file. And for the very bright stops, they throw some of that information away. And for the dark stops, they throw a lot of that information away. And so in photography, linear raw, it's very the way you always think about linear raw in photography is you get one stop of dynamic range for every bit that you have in the bit depth. So a 14-bit raw file can store 14 stops of dynamic range. That's straight linear raw. That's the only way it works. Incidentally, if you see people, when you see people claiming that their 14-bit cameras store 16 stops of dynamic range, that's because they're not looking at the pixel or engineering dynamic range. They're looking at a picture level dynamic range, and when you compress or downsample to the picture size, whether that's being done in your computer where you're, say, taking your 45 megapixel or whatever source image and downsampling it to 8 megapixels, or that's being done optically by the eye, either way, that lowers the noise, which reduces the noise floor, which increases the dynamic range. And if you've already got 13 and change or whatever, 14, it won't be higher than 14, but 13 and change stops of dynamic range at the pixel level and a high resolution sensor, by the end of all of that processing, you can have more than 14 stops of dynamic range in the picture, in that sort of way of looking at it. And if that sounds weird or complicated, that's part of the problem with a lot of the engineering side of things, is there is a lot of ways that you can look at things to either shift numbers or a different approach to what it's doing and how it's working, even though it's doing the same thing everywhere, but depending on what you're looking at can affect how you interpret the information. So anyway, the problem with log gamma curves, all of the Canon log curves, all of the Sony log curves, all of the Nikon log curves, it doesn't matter what brand, all of the log curves do the same thing, is in your deep shadows, there's very little information to work with. You can have several stops of shadow information that only have one bit available to them, or one value, I shouldn't say one bit, one value available to them. If you go up a value, you're a stop brighter. You go down a value, you're a stop darker. And that is all the information that is there. There's no precision in those very extreme shadow cases. And that precision was potentially in the raw data, which is another potentially good reason to use raw data if there's a way you can process it and understand it and get the information out of it. But once you put it into a log gamma curve or a log compressed video file, that information is lost. So the extreme shadows, it's very difficult to make very precise or understanding of what's going on, or measurements, because what turns out to be a one value change turns into a much larger than one value change in brightness. And that's something to be aware of, and that was certainly a limitation of what I was doing in my testing, which is again something that in retrospect, thinking about it well down the road after having done it, I maybe should have thought more about how that shakes out. But then on the same token, looking at the end results, I didn't really see a whole lot of difference, because we're talking about near black in the final image. And yes, you can manipulate that and you could sort of stretch it, but then you're exaggerating something to make it more obvious, which is something I did in a couple of cases in the video, because I thought it was useful to look at a very exaggerated view of what was going on, but that's also not how you're actually going to use or see the data. The other thing that's, I think, worth talking about is, of course, since I was doing this with HEVC compressed or compressed video data, that's all stored in YCRCB format or YCC format, which is Luma Chroma Chroma. I've done a video sort of talking about a little bit about what Luma Chroma Chroma means, but there's a couple of sort of relevant things to understand, which is there is a one-to-one translation, both from RGB to Luma Chroma Chroma and back. If you're using 444 chroma subsampling and you are not applying a log gamma curve to your data, your chrominance or your luminance data in your YCC file or part of the file, you can directly recover whatever the original RGB values were from the Luma Chroma Chroma data. Now, that's just a interesting talking point in this case, because I had Canon's log gamma 3 curve applied and the cinema color gamut, and it's not necessarily like it would be no easy or small feat, and of course because the log gamma curves are lossy, it'd be no easy or small feat to translate that back into the original RGB data, which again is another place where it's a good point to have done or do the testing in RAW. But again, without a way to decode the actual straight raw data, it doesn't necessarily help me in a meaningful way to do that. So with that said, I want to sort of wrap up this discussion with a couple of thoughts. Namely, I found some value in the testing I did. I really expected auto black balance to be kind of a vestigial carryover from the early days of Canon cinema cameras that, like, why would they do that still? Why would you need to use that still? Why wouldn't they just black balance like every other camera does? Which, including in photo mode, the R5C does this exact, it black balances just like every other camera. There's mask pixels. They average the mask pixels to get the black level. And so the pixels never see light. The black level subtracted from the signal in all of the imaging pixels before gamma or before white balance corrections are done, and so on and so forth. And you just roll with that. That said, while I did discover very clearly, at least, that there are certain cases where you absolutely want to run auto black balance, I'm not totally happy with all of the testing that I did, or with the testing I did. I think it could have been done better and broader and more comprehensively and more useful. I think there was room to do it better, is I guess the best way to put it. Then again, at the same time, I've never really seen anybody do any of this. I'm sure Netflix did it when they wrote their guide. They didn't just copy what Canon said in the manual. At least I would hope that they did, but I'm not 100% certain, and they certainly didn't publish the data or anything to talk about it. And I've never really seen, when you start talking about or looking at, other YouTube creators, other R5C shooters, other Canon cinema camera shooters, really talking about auto black balance, using it, what it does, all of that kind of stuff. So there's that whole aspect. I think I could have done better. That's one part. There's also a lot of questions that I ran into from this whole thing about the documentation. What Canon says in the manual about like when to auto black balance, and whether or not that information or the documentation there is a reflection of when you actually need to auto black balance the camera. There are certainly cases where it makes sense, like temperature changes, even though I couldn't reproduce a need to rebalance the camera after a like 5 or 6 degree temperature change, or potentially a lot higher depending on which temperature the camera actually got to. But there's also the like changing modes. How much of that is because you really need to black balance when you change modes versus the fact that there's a black balance saved for each mode that gets cleared when you reset the camera, and then you're in a default state that doesn't work quite right without being sort of rerun. I don't know, and that's something I'd love to have sort of a more comprehensive, like, you know, like a better answer from Canon on, or better documentation from Canon on. I also ran into stuff in the tests that I expected a change. I expected to see the black balance need to be rerun from a temperature change, and I didn't see the black balance needing to be rerun from the temperature change. And so I don't know, like, that's why, that was a large part of why I said in my video that I think Canon's doing both. I think they've got like a full sensor map, which is really the only thing that, again, not having access to the firmware, but that's really the only reason I can come up with why the camera would need to run for 45 seconds or so to create an auto black balance, because by and large, every other camera can get it from the pixel data that's masked on one frame. It's 1 to 10% of the pixels on the sensor are masked. They get averaged, subtracted, boom, done, easy. It's super fast. It does not take 45 seconds for the camera to do those kinds of calculations. It takes microseconds for the camera to do those kinds of calculations. So the only reason I can come up with that they're doing this more complicated, more time-intensive process is they're actually mapping the whole sensor area. I mean, this is the only thing that makes sense, because at 24 frames a second, in 45 seconds, the camera takes about 1,000 frames, or will cover about 1,000 frames, which gives them a fairly good per pixel basis to do the averaging down and noise reduction, or to get the noise reduction, to come to an actual noise, almost noise-free. It's not going to be 100% noise-free, but almost noise-free black level for like every photo site. Then if you store that potentially at full resolution, potentially at a quarter of the resolution, like it doesn't necessarily, I'm willing to bet it doesn't actually need to be at 8K for the black balance to work. It could be at like 1080p, and that would cover like every 4 pixels or every 16 pixels or whatever. The variances are probably large enough due to defects in the substrate and stuff like that, that a lower resolution area would do fine at correcting. But if you're doing it basically on a pixel level, to get rid of the noise, you have to go through time. You have to have many frames to do the averaging to noise reduce. So my assumption is that's what they're doing with the auto black balance. But then when I ran like the temperature test, and the back of the camera was 110 degrees and Fahrenheit, and I did the original black balance at 78 degrees or 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's should be more than adequate to significantly alter the dark current and therefore the black balance of the camera. I didn't see a change. And that led me to the hypothesis that they are doing a full sensor map, but then that full sensor map is being combined with the masked pixel information to get like the black balance on a per frame basis. But I can't say for sure. And if you think that sounds like the camera's doing a lot of math, it is. And the camera is doing a lot of math. And that's what these cameras are good at, is doing a lot of math very quickly. But again, I can't say for 100% on whether that's actually the case or not. So anyway, that was the sort of extra thoughts that I had post producing that video. Could it be better? Yes. Was there some interesting things? Absolutely. Should you run auto black balance if you're a Canon cinema camera owner? Yes. If you want the optimum image quality out of your camera, you should run auto black balance. At least, I like Netflix recommendations at the start of every shooting day and anytime the camera temperature changes significantly. You can actually get away with it a lot less than that. You know, if you're shooting in a very consistent temperature, like a studio or something, you probably only need to run it after a firmware update. But that is the one place I would say it's absolutely critical. After a firmware update, because firmware updates to the R5 or the Cinema EOS OS reset the camera settings. After a firmware update, you should absolutely run auto black balance on at least normal recording, but also like slow and fast motion if you use that a lot or at all, to at least have a valid starting point for the camera to work with, as opposed to nothing, which is what the camera will be dealing with if you don't do that. So anyway, there you go, an extended discussion on auto black balance. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends on a social media platform of your choice, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us directly by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.